Sequels get bigger budgets, better marketing, louder conversations. But a lot of franchises only exist because the earlier games took the risks that they did, experimenting, stumbling, and laying the groundwork that later entries would improve on or perfect. Today we're talking about great games that live in the shadow of their sequels. The games people skip because they've heard the next one is better without realizing how much they're missing. Before Red Dead Redemption redefined its open-world storytelling, Red Dead Revolver was a much smaller, stranger, and far more arcade-like experiment. Because it doesn't resemble its sequels at all, it's often dismissed as an awkward prototype. But that does it a real disservice. This is structured more like a series of playable Western set pieces than a living world. Levels are tight, linear, and built around score chasing, reflex shooting, and cinematic duels. That design choice immediately made it feel outdated once Redemption arrived, but it also gave Revolver a distinct identity. It plays closer to a stylized action shooter than a simulation, and that focus gives it a sharp, almost arcade purity. The tone leans heavily into exaggerated Western tropes. Characters are larger than life, villains are cartoonishly evil, and the violence is unapologetically pulpy. It doesn't aim for realism or emotional subtlety. It wants to feel like a spaghetti western filtered through a video game lens. That makes it rough around the edges, but also memorable in ways the more grounded sequels intentionally moved away from. Mechanically, Dead Eye is simpler. Combat arenas are repetitive, and enemy AI hasn't aged gracefully. These flaws are real, and they're why many players bounced off it even before Redemption existed. But Revolver deserves credit for laying the foundation, introducing core ideas, tone, and gunplay concept that Rockstar would later evolve into something legendary. It's not the best Red Dead game, but it's an important one. And viewed on its own terms, it's a bold, weird, and unfairly forgotten piece of the franchise's history.
And here's your herbs.
Before Nier Automata turned the series into a mainstream success, Nier Replicant existed as a strange, emotionally devastating cult classic that many people either ignored or misunderstood. It didn't look impressive next to other action RPGs of its era, and its combat felt rough compared to what Platinum Games would later deliver. But what it lacked in polish, it made up for in something far rarer: emotional honesty. On the surface, Replicant seems simple. A young protagonist trying to save someone he loves in a broken world. But the longer you play, the more the game quietly dismantles that premise. Perspective shifts. Context changes. Actions you once felt justified begin to feel deeply uncomfortable. Few games have ever been so willing to implicate the player directly in its themes. The structure was risky. Multiple playthroughs weren't just encouraged. They were required to understand the full story. Replaying familiar sections with new information recontextualized entire characters and events. For some players, this repetition felt tedious. For others, it was transformative. It forced reflection in a way traditional storytelling rarely does. Mechanically, it's uneven. Combat can feel floaty, side quests are often mundane, and pacing issues are real. These flaws hurt its initial reception and made it easy to dismiss. But beneath those rough edges is one of the most haunting narratives in modern gaming, elevated by a soundtrack that remains unforgettable even so many years later. Automata refined the gameplay and presentation, but Replicant is where the heart of the series lives. It's quieter, sadder, and more intimate, and for many, it hits even harder because of that. The Witcher 3 gets almost all the attention, and for good reason, but The Witcher 2 is the game that truly defined what the series wanted to be. It's tighter, more focused, and far more political than its successor, even if it lacks the massive open world that later stole the spotlight. Unlike 3's sprawling design, the second game is built around dense, carefully constructed regions packed with meaningful quests. Almost nothing feels like filler. Choices matter immediately and dramatically, sometimes splitting the entire second half of the game into completely different storylines depending on a single decision. Few RPGs before or since have committed that hard a consequence. The writing is sharp and unapologetically adult. There's no clear good versus evil, just power, manipulation, and survival. Kings lie, rebels betray. Allies use you when it suits them. Geralt isn't saving the world. He's trying to stay alive in a system designed to crush people like him. Combat and systems are clunkier, no question. Animations can feel stiff, difficulty spikes are real, and the learning curve is steep early on. Those flaws turn some players away. But under that roughness is a game with incredible narrative ambition and some of the strongest branching storytelling in RPG history. Witcher 3 perfected accessibility, whereas 2 perfected intent. And without it, the series wouldn't be what it is today. Suikoden 2 is widely regarded as one of the greatest JRPGs ever made. But that reputation often causes people to overlook the game that made it possible. Suikoden 1 may be smaller in scope, but it's remarkably focused and in some ways more tightly paced than its legendary sequel. The story wastes no time. What begins as a classic tale of empire and rebellion quickly turns personal, forcing the protagonist to confront betrayal, loss, and the cost of loyalty. There's very little filler. The narrative moves fast, and that urgency gives the game a sharp emotional edge. The 108 Stars of Destiny system was revolutionary at the time, recruiting characters from all walks of life. Soldiers, thieves, chefs, scholars made the world feel alive. Watching your headquarters evolve as your army grows creates a sense of momentum that few RPGs even attempt. It's not just about power, it's about community. Combat is straightforward, sometimes even simple, especially compared to 2's refinements. Balance can be rough, and some characters are clearly more useful than others. But the variety of battle formats, standard fights, duels, and large-scale army battles keeps the experience fresh throughout its relatively short runtime. The sequel may be deeper, longer, and more refined, but the first one is lean, confident, and emotionally direct. It's the foundation of everything that followed, and it remains a powerful RPG in its own right. Not just a prelude, but a complete experience that deserves to be remembered. Before Dark Souls became a cultural phenomenon, Demon's Souls was the strange, punishing experiment that almost slipped through the cracks. When it first released, it wasn't marketed well, reviews were mixed, and many players bounced off it hard. It was slower, harsher, and far less forgiving than anything else on consoles at the time. And that's exactly why it mattered. The world of Boletaria was bleak, fragmented, and intentionally opaque. There was no traditional narrative handholding. Instead, story details were hidden in item descriptions, environmental clues, and enemy placement. This felt alien for players used to exposition-heavy RPGs. For others, it was intoxicating. It trusted players to pay attention and piece things together themselves. Combat demanded patience. Enemies hit hard. Death was punishing, and healing was limited. The game didn't care if you were frustrated. It expected you to adapt. That philosophy would later be refined and balanced. But this was where the core identity was born. Systems like stamina management, risk-reward exploration, and learning through failure all originated here. It's true that Dark Souls improved structure, connectivity, and balance. But Demon's Souls had something more raw. Its atmosphere was heavier, its world more oppressive, and its sense of isolation unmatched. Nexus Hub aside, the game felt lonely in a way later entries softened. For many players, this wasn't love at first sight. But looking back, it's clear this was the foundation. Without it, the entire Souls genre simply wouldn't exist. Helldivers 1 is a perfect example of a game that became massively influential only after its sequel exploded in popularity. With Helldivers 2 dominating conversations, it's easy to forget that the original was already doing something incredibly special, just on a smaller scale. Instead of a third-person cinematic spectacle, this was a top-down, twin-stick shooter built entirely around chaos, coordination, and friendly fire. And not optional friendly fire, mandatory friendly fire. Every bullet, airstrike, and orbital drop could kill teammates just as easily as enemies, forcing constant communication and situational awareness. The satire was sharp. The over-the-top propaganda, exaggerated military language, and absurdly bureaucratic managed democracy were already fully formed here. Missions felt intentionally unfair at times, with enemies overwhelming you not because of bad design, but because panic and miscommunication were part of the experience. Where the struggle was accessibility. Solo play was brutal, progression was slow, and without a coordinated squad, the game could feel punishing rather than fun. That limited its mainstream appeal and kept it niche for years. But mechanically and conceptually, it was rock solid. Stratagem inputs, shared screens, escalating difficulty, all of it laid the groundwork for the sequel's success. Helldivers 2 may have refined and expanded the formula, but the original proved it worked in the first place. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't friendly, and it didn't hold your hand, and that's exactly why it deserves more respect today. When people talk about Resident Evil, the conversation almost always jumps straight to Resident Evil 2 or 4. But the original Resident Evil, both the 1996 PS1 release and the 2002 GameCube remake, is where survival horror truly found its identity. The first game is slower, more restrictive, and far more claustrophobic than its sequels. The Spencer Mansion isn't an action playground. It's a puzzle box designed to make you feel vulnerable. Limited ammo, fixed camera angles, and tank controls weren't accidents. They were deliberate design choices meant to create tension through uncertainty and restraint. At the time, the voice acting and dialogue became infamous. And yes, some of it hasn't aged gracefully. But beneath that campiness is a carefully constructed experience built around fear of the unknown. Every door opening animation, every footstep echoing through an empty hallway, reinforced the idea that danger could appear at any moment. The 2002 remake refined the original without losing its soul. Improved visuals, reworked enemy placement, and new mechanics like Crimson Heads made the mansion even more threatening. It respected the original's pacing and intent instead of transforming it into something more action-focused. Resident Evil 2 expanded the scope. Resident Evil 4 reinvented the genre. But the original is where survival horror was defined. It taught players that sometimes less power makes for a stronger experience. And that legacy still shapes horror games today. Before System Shock 2 became the genre-defining classic everyone talks about, the original System Shock was already doing things that felt decades ahead of its time. It wasn't just an immersive sim. It was one of the earliest games to truly trust the player inside a hostile, systemic world and say, figure it out. Set aboard the Citadel Station, the game drops you into a nightmare ruled by Shodan, one of the most iconic antagonists in gaming history. There's no traditional quest structure, no glowing objective markers, and no cinematic handholding. Progress comes from exploration, paying attention to audio logs, reading terminals, and slowly understanding how the station functions as a whole. That freedom was revolutionary, but it also made the game difficult to approach. The original controls were clunky even by 90s standards, the interface was overwhelming, and the learning curve was steep. Many players bounced off it before discovering what made it special. That friction is a big reason it lived in the shadow of System Shock 2, which streamlined many of these systems. But what the first game accomplished is remarkable. Inventory management, hacking, cyberspace sections, non-linear progression. These ideas weren't just present, they were deeply interconnected. The horror didn't come from jump scares, but from isolation, limited resources, and the creeping realization that you were completely alone. With the modern remake bringing the original vision closer to what it always wanted to be, it's easier than ever to see why System Shock mattered. 2 may be more polished, but the original is where the genre's DNA was written, messy, brilliant, and far ahead of its time. Persona 2 is often treated like a footnote in the series, overshadowed almost entirely by the later entries. And yet, in many ways, it tells one of the most ambitious stories Atlus has ever written. Split into two interconnected games, Innocent Sin and Eternal Punishment, it leans heavily into psychological horror, rumor-fueled reality bending, and deeply personal trauma. The premise alone is wild. Rumors spread by people literally become real. Urban legends, fears, and conspiracies reshape the world in real time. It's strange, uncomfortable, and bold in a way later entries rarely attempt. The tone is darker and more surreal than modern Persona. Characters grapple with guilt, identity, repression, and past mistakes that refuse to stay buried. There's less slice-of-life charm and far more emotional weight. It feels closer to a Shin Megami Tensei game wearing a Persona skin. Mechanically, this one shows its age. Combat is slower, menus are clunky, and dungeon design can be repetitive. Negotiation systems are deeper but less streamlined, which can frustrate newcomers. These rough edges are a big reason why many players skip it entirely. But narratively, Persona 2 does things the later games never fully return to. It takes risks, it commits to consequences, and it tells a complete story across two games in a way that feels deliberate rather than episodic. Persona 5 may be the most stylish, but the second game remains the most daring, and that's why it deserves far more respect than it gets. Before Shadow Hearts, Covenant became the fan favorite. The original Shadow Hearts was already doing something wildly different from other RPGs of its time. While most JRPGs leaned into optimism or high fantasy, this game went in the opposite direction. Gothic horror, historical fiction, and a tone that felt genuinely unsettling. Set in an alternate early 20th century world, the story blends real historical events with supernatural horror in a way that feels grounded and bleak. You're not saving a colorful fantasy kingdom. You're navigating war, cults, and ancient forces that don't care about heroics. The atmosphere is heavy, sometimes uncomfortable, and intentionally so. Combat introduced the Judgment Ring, a timing-based mechanic that forced players to stay engaged every single turn. Miss your timing, and attacks fail. Hit risk zones and damage spikes. It added tension to even basic encounters, but it also turned some players off who preferred traditional menu-driven systems. That friction is part of why the game never hit mainstream popularity. Narratively, the original Shadow Hearts is rougher and more restrained than its sequel. Character arcs aren't as polished, pacing can feel uneven, and some systems lack refinement. But it also takes risks Covenant wouldn't exist without. It establishes the world, the tone, and the emotional weight that later games would build on. Covenant may be better overall, but the original is where the soul of the series was forged.